Welcome to ESG Decoded, where we navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance, ESG. Join me, Amanda Shea, and Erika Schiller as we explore the intersection of sustainability, innovation, and ethical leadership.
Hello, and welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Erika Schiller, and today I have two guests joining me. We have Anna Stablum, the Director of Business Development in Asia for ClimeCo. You've recognized Anna's voice from joining us on a couple other discussions around CORSIA. So Anna, thanks for joining us. And we have Bryan McCann. Bryan is the Director of Supply at Climate Impact X. Bryan and Anna, thank you so much for joining us to talk about REDD. And when I say REDD, I'm not talking about the color, I'm talking about avoided deforestation. REDD is an acronym for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And Bryan, I'd love if you could kind of lay the groundwork on what is REDD, what do we mean by that, and tell us a bit about the history.
Absolutely. So REDD is a framework and approach to reducing deforestation from tropical deforestation. It is the approach that we take to save the rainforest. And why is this important? For the world, it's important because protecting tropical forests is the most cost-effective way of global mitigation. So there's a famous study from 2017 from Griscom et al., where up to a third of the cost-effective mitigation globally can come from nature-based solutions. And of that, it's a total quarter of what we can do today to get us to net zero by 2050. And we desperately need to scale up funding to supporting tropical forests. I'm sure everybody's heard some version of this stat, but every 15 minutes, we lose an area of rainforest the size of Central Park, and every year, an area the size of the island of Sicily. And that's only the cost of the climate. When you destroy rainforests, there's massive other ecological effects on the local regions. You need rainforests to generate rain, for example. And as well, you lose the biodiversity and drive the extinction of the species that live in the forest, as well as having some dramatic impacts on the communities that live in and depend on the forest. And so why this is important for the climate is obvious, and why it's important to, I think, the companies that are looking to accelerate their sustainability strategy is that this has been a key part of a lot of companies, the carbon credits that they've been purchasing over the last 10 to 15 years. In 2022, roughly $1 billion of funding went to REDD Plus from the voluntary carbon market, which is a pretty significant amount of funding, which accounts for roughly 160 million tons of emissions that are reduced, which is about the size of the emissions of the Netherlands. And so that's one Netherlands for saving the rainforest. But I think the question for us today is how do we scale that up to protect the forests that we need?
Thanks, Bryan. So conceptually, you're saying, look, we have these goals for net zero. Countries have signed on to the Paris Agreement that they want to reduce emissions. So we need to protect our existing rainforests. We need to protect our forest canopy to help us both absorb carbon from the atmosphere and prevent the emissions of deforesting. So aren't governments doing this today? Can you help us understand, where there's kind of a gap between the kind of goals and, your emissions reduction goals and action today, and why we need REDD carbon credits?
Yeah, absolutely. So REDD Plus, for most of its life, it's been something that's publicly funded. So the term REDD Plus, I think it's probably fair to say in climate that any acronym that has more than 5 or 6 letters in it is probably coming from something that's negotiated internationally. That came from COP. So listeners might have heard of COP26 or COP28 last year in Dubai. REDD Plus has been created as a framework through these different discussions. It first came about in 2005 as a part of the Montreal COP, where a couple of tropical forest countries, Costa Rica and PNG, suggested the idea that they have tropical forests and perhaps that they can get international support to be able to conserve those. It took another 8 years to finalize the rules and the approach to how that should happen. So this is how you think about monitoring rates of deforestation, how you think about safeguards, and approaches to supporting the communities that live in the forest. And that was in 2013. And then it was at that point that you started to have international funding going towards forest conservation in other countries. This funding either comes directly, so Norway, roughly a third to a half of the total funding, donor funding that has been going toward protecting tropical forests comes from Norway. So Norway to Brazil, Norway to Guyana, or it comes through different international development banks. So the World Bank, as an example, has a big program called the FCPF that's been doing a lot of this, and as well the Green Climate Fund, which is a multilateral development bank strictly for climate action, was founded to be a key conduit for this kind of international funding. Part of the challenge is that protecting rainforests is extremely hard. So if you imagine that iPhones only came out in 2007, Google Maps, which allows you to pull up a map and actually see the rainforest, see satellite imagery of rainforests. That's only been around since 2013, because most of the satellite imagery that you need to see if the forest is still there, most of that was only made available to the public 10 or 15 years ago. So most of the initial funding that came from Norway and the World Bank and others, a lot of it, instead of actually going to pay for reductions in deforestation, it was actually going to what's called readiness funding. So helping the tropical forest countries be ready to then go and protect their forests. And so it took roughly a decade to sort of stand up these programs, these government-led programs in tropical forest countries to actually be able to protect their forests. And when I say readiness, I was taking a look at the Ghana program. And so when we talk about readiness funding and actually protecting a forest, what does that mean? Well, in Ghana, it's the National Climate Change Policy of 2013. It's the National Forest and Wildlife Policy of 2012. It is a Forestry Development Master Plan from 2016 to 2036, and the Ghana Forest Plantation Strategy from 2016 to 2040. And that's just the legal frameworks that they need, much less actually training people up and engaging with communities and hiring park rangers and actually rolling out these programs. And so that's really where the state of play is today, is that from the sort of the country-led efforts is there are many countries in which they've received this readiness funding and in some cases have actually started to reduce deforestation. But at the same time is we can't wait. And so that's really where the voluntary market has come in, is starting to run what are called private projects or REDD+ projects. So instead of being government-led, looking across the entire country or entire state, why not just buy a piece of land? Because and conserve it that way. This has been happening in the U.S. for a long time, and what it really means is, for example, if in a given country they're opening up a piece of rainforest for some form of development, maybe it's for palm forms of agriculture, for palm plantation, for cattle. Erika, you and me, we could go and buy that piece of land and put it into conservation. And the way that we could do that and the way that we could fund that is through carbon credits. So the first REDD+ project was in Indonesia called Rimba Raya. So this came about in 2009. So this is roughly 10 years before the first round of funding was raised for the Green Climate Fund, and 4 years before all this negotiation, all of this COP processes to create a national framework for REDD+. This is 4 years before that happened. And so what we see is that it takes time for multilateral approaches to work, and it takes time to get governments on board, whereas as individuals, private companies, they can act faster. And so so it was 2009 that the first REDD+ project came about, and then coming through today in the voluntary carbon market is REDD+ in 2022 became the largest segment of projects or of credits in the market. So roughly a third of the total credits issued were from REDD+. And so where we're at today is that inflection point of you had this private market that's evolved to some extent independently of this public national government-led approach. And so where we're at today, and we're where we sort of arrived at over the last couple of years, is how are these two systems going to merge, and how are they both going to work together to save the forest that we all desperately need.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for laying that out, Bryan. And just, I wanted to add, COP, you mentioned, that's the Congress of Parties. It's an international organization that kind of gets together annually to talk about the environment. That's where, Paris Agreement came from, Kyoto Protocol, all of these things, in order to address climate change and fight climate change and also adapt to it. But Anna, I wanted to bring you in. In your region, you are looking at markets and talking to customers about different credit types. What are the common questions that you might get around REDD and conversations around REDD projects? Because what I heard from Bryan is these projects, they started out of international discussions, but it's really, really slow to actually move forward for frameworks and legal agreements, and to actually bring in the funding. And so, with that gap, but with the conceptual idea, private markets stepped in and said, hey, we can do this faster. Let's get moving. Let's protect this forest today while the governments are figuring it out, right? And that's kind of how the voluntary carbon market operates in a lot of different activity types, right? Is the governments are going to regulate this at some point, we hope. But in the meantime, let's protect climate action or perform climate action today. So handing off to you, Anna, what are your thoughts?
No, thanks, Erika. Thanks for having me on the podcast again. And thanks, Bryan, for joining us. It's been great to hear that historical framework. I think this can be a very confusing market because, of course, the way that especially some of these REDD Plus projects have been featured throughout when the concept first began, it's hard to understand what is a REDD Plus project, a private one, versus a sovereign one. So I think you made that clear, and Erika as well, of course, saying that the VCM market, as often happens, is there before we get to something else, before regulation kicks in. And it is interesting to just hear about the various bodies. I really enjoyed, Bryan, the way that you talked about the World Bank, the UN. It can be very confusing. I find it myself quite confusing, and we're spending a lot of time looking at these markets. And I think the key thing, of course, is for me, and especially talking to buyers of REDD Plus, and obviously it has been a very popular type of credit because of the biodiversity benefits, because of the co-benefits, because it's really having an impact on the people living in these forests to conserve the forests. Now, of course, what is interesting is that we've had single projects being somewhat criticized for various reasons. It can be a baseline problem, it can be other types of criticism that we've seen for individual projects. And then, of course, the question comes, how can governments call it a better job than these private actors? And why would the REDD Plus as a jurisdictional REDD Plus be so much better in any case for buyers to buy? So, of course, we see credits already in the market. So we have Guyana, the country of Guyana in Latin America. They have got a project that they are selling as a sovereign project. Ghana, Bryan mentioned, there are lots of countries that are now starting to sell these in the market. And I think it's confusing for buyers to understand, why are these credits so different to some of the private actors? You mentioned Rimba Raya in Indonesia, and there are other big flagship REDD Plus project. So I think at this point, Erika, what we're seeing is a little bit of confusion, and I think this is also tied to, which we can talk about in a little bit, is obviously how you're going to move from these REDD Plus projects and the history, where we talk about Norway as a donor country, to an Article 6 trading framework, where a country like Norway could actually buy again, sovereign credits and use them against their own nationally determined contributions and on their way to net zero. So at this point, we're a bit in an inflection point, and I would love to hear Bryan's views on single individual projects of REDD versus jurisdictional projects of REDD. What's the difference? Why would some in the market think that jurisdictional REDD come with, call it, a better quality or more integrity than a private company and their project? And then, of course, what I would love to hear more about and what we can discuss is how are these now moving from being a result-based payment to being actually used as offset on a country's, again, Norway as a good example, could they use these credits on their way to net zero as under their net zero targets under Paris Agreement?
Yeah, that's great, and there's a lot to that. So perhaps starting with the different types of credits that are out there. I think when we talk about, in the interest of having a thing to call things, is there's project-based REDD, which is the example of Bryan and Erika. We go and buy a forestry concession and we fund that through carbon credits as opposed to agriculture. So that's project-based REDD. That's been the private approach taken so far. This isn't necessarily fully private. Oftentimes, this can happen in close partnership with local communities or with local authorities, but it's not necessarily run by the central government of a country. The other approach tends to be called jurisdictional REDD+. So this is an approach to protecting forests across an entire jurisdiction, so an entire country or in some cases, the state or province, in cases like Brazil, where some of the states in the Amazon are the size of countries. The key, I think the challenge of project-based REDD is really trying to predict rates of deforestation. And so not to preempt a part of the conversation later, but some listeners might know is there was a quite influential article in The Guardian at the beginning of last year that criticized REDD+ projects, saying that over 90% of credits that have been issued are actually hot air, weren't actually real credits. What they were really saying there is that depending on the assumptions that you make of how much deforestation was going to happen, is the credits that are issued, maybe it wasn't actually avoiding deforestation, because the way the project-based REDD+ generate carbon credits and calculate their baseline, as Anna mentioned, is that we've got our piece of land, and then what you'll do is you'll look around in the region and try to find similar pieces of land that have experienced deforestation, and you'll say that that piece of land was deforested at about 1% a year. Since the piece of land that we're looking to protect, we'll say it's 1% a year, and then you issue credits for avoiding that 1%. What the Guardian article said was that, well, actually, maybe it wasn't 1%, maybe it was 0.2%. And then all of a sudden, as we're into a very complicated academic argument. But I think to sort of spare the listeners that, is it's really an argument about the counterfactual and trying to predict the future. The benefit of jurisdictional REDD+ is that it sidesteps that entirely. Or because you're covering an entire country, what you can say is you can look at and the deforestation rate across the entire country for the last 5 years or 7 years. And so what you can say is that so long as the deforestation rate goes down in aggregate, you get credits. And there's deductions for conservatism and sort of other maths involved, but that's really the key. And so if it was 1 million tons last year, or rather 1 million tons on average over the last 5 years, it's 900,000 tons this year. More or less, you get 80,000 credits or 100,000 credits. Simple, easy, great. The other advantage of jurisdictional REDD+ is that it's an explicit partnership and oftentimes being led by the host government. And they're the ones that control economic policy, they're the ones that control tax policy, and they're the ones that control enforcement. And so if we're thinking, because what we're really talking about is orienting economies away from deforestation, away from exploiting forests, and towards conservation and protection. And so that's not something that any one private sector actor can do. That's something that it takes every lever of government and of civil society to bring about. And as well, if you're if you're establishing protected areas, establishing national parks, those protections need to be enforced. And ultimately, it's the government that needs to have both the political will as well as the resources to actually do that. Because oftentimes, in lots of these places, even if a given area says protected on a map, it isn't necessarily protected in practice. And so that's really where the funding and finance in the voluntary market can come in. And so as these two types of projects converge, is that you have these national programs that some countries are in a position to run and to roll out. So as Anna mentioned, Guyana, there's a lot of countries that start with G that do this. Guyana in Latin America has gone out and issued the first sets of jurisdictional REDD+ credits that are available to the market. And then a few other countries, including Ghana and West Africa, have signed agreements to sell some of these credits to specifically a coalition of governments and companies called the LEAF Coalition that was founded with the explicit goal of helping to incentivize and move forward many of these countries in rolling out these programs. But the private market isn't going away. And these private sector projects are both extremely necessary because you have the expertise, you have the funding to make action happen on the ground. And so it's really thinking about how we can build upon the approaches that were established 15, 20 years ago in Rimbaraya and mitigate some of the issues that have been raised through the Guardian and others. And so what's happening to the REDD+ projects is that they're evolving to fit in and what's called nest in these jurisdictional approaches. And so in the case where there is a government and they've got the capacity to run a jurisdictional REDD+ government program, which not every government has the ability to do, is there are ways to account for both of those things happening together. And then in other countries that have chosen not to run and issue credits nationally or don't have the resources to do so, what these projects are now evolving to be able to do is to fit within a national rates of deforestation. And so in the old world, it's Bryan and Erika have a project. We're predicting our own rate of deforestation. Anna's got a project in another part of the world. She's predicting her own rate of deforestation. In some cases, you add together all those different predictions, and turns out you get more deforestation than is actually happening. And so in the new approach that's being rolled out, is step one is to figure out the national rate of deforestation in a given country. And then step two is to allocate that out to each of the individual projects in a way that is ultimately conservative. And so the Guardian criticism, which is these different, many of these projects are overestimating the amount of deforestation that they're stopping, that gets fixed. And then if over time, more and more countries are in a position to scale up and run their own government-led jurisdictional programs, that's great. Then we've got the way that we have an approach to fit the private sector REDD+ projects into those. And if many governments don't have the ability to do, then at least we have an approach to have an effective private sector-led project-based approach as well.
Well, I think it's really exciting to hear the private response, right? Basically, Verra is the largest carbon registry that trades REDD credits, that produces and issues REDD credits today. And they have been very impacted and responsive to the criticism of, historical practices on REDD and, and as you mentioned, Bryan, incorporating new tools like satellite imagery to verify the forest is protected or not. Those are all important updates to and responses to issues or gaps as this market is being developed. But it's really important to protect our natural resources, protect our forests if we're trying to protect ourselves from climate change and respond to it. And today we're really wanting to focus on the supply of REDD, how these credits are coming to market. How are we seeing the volumes come out, and what about timing in terms of what's available today and when these new programs will be coming out, when new countries will be joining it?
Yeah, that's a really, really fun and interesting question. I'd say from the and again, there's these sort of two types of credits that are being issued on the market. There's the project-based credits and the jurisdictional credits. For the project-based credits, a lot of developers are waiting. So as this new approach is rolled out, depending on the type of project, depending on the type of deforestation that they're looking to avoid, some of these projects might lose anywhere from 50 to 90% of what they expected that they would get. And so you go and develop this project, you make a set of assumptions that you'll be able to run it and have a business, and then all of a sudden your revenue falls by 90%. I think we'll sort of see what happens. And unfortunately, not some of these projects will be able to continue, and some won't. And then the as you mentioned, Verra, which is the body that runs the standard and issues these credits, they are rolling out this new approach for projects to account for this deforestation in a staggered way. So they're currently piloting it in 10 jurisdictions, a handful of Brazilian states, plus several countries. I think Peru, they finalized the baseline, or at least released a sort of draft version of that a couple of weeks ago. And then all projects will be moved to this new accounting approach by the end of 2025. And so in that cases, we'll see how many of the current projects are able to continue to run. And then hopefully this will return enough buyer confidence to the market to have enough additional investment to start up new projects. On the jurisdictional side, there's really three sets of countries to think about. The first set is currently just Guyana. So this is a country that's received a lot of support, particularly from Norway. They've got their own program. The team there has done a phenomenal job of being the first through the what's called ARCH trees, which is a different, so ART is analogous to Verra. It's a different standards body run by Winrock International in California. So they've got a standard for jurisdictional REDD+. Guyana was the first to make it through. So as Anna mentioned, they are offering their credits to the market. These credits can be used by airlines for some of their international obligations. And the sort of nuances and complexity of that we'll get to in the next episode. But that's Guyana. The second set are jurisdictions that are being funded by the World Bank. So as I mentioned earlier, the World Bank's got a program called FCPF that's been running since the late 2000s to stand up and fund a lot of these programs. So many of the countries, and then the World Bank, what they've effectively done is they say, well, we'll give you a lot of readiness funding, help you stand up the programs, and then we'll pay you for results. And so as you go and reduce deforestation, we'll pay you per ton, $5 a ton. Most of those countries will finish that program and sort of graduate over the next year or so, year to 18 months. There are 5 countries so far that have received funding from the World Bank, payments for results. And then this program ends. And then, great, they've sort of graduated. They've got a great program to be able to reduce deforestation nationally. And then they have the choice of, do they want to continue with the World Bank and receive more donor money, or do they want to bring this money to the private market? And then the third set of jurisdictions are those that have signed agreements with LEAF. So as I mentioned earlier, LEAF is which I helped co-found, is a $1.5 billion public-private fund that's actually sort of similar in approach to what the World Bank is doing, where it's having a significant amount of money and then working with each of the jurisdictions to sign long-term offtake. So it says if you reduce deforestation today, you'll receive payments in the future. And so many of these credits, at least through 2028, 2030, will be, if they're not sticking with the World Bank, instead they'll be purchased by many of the participants in LEAF. So these include Amazon, McKinsey, as well as the governments of the US, UK, Norway. And so I think the total number, the sort of aggregate number that came out in a study earlier this year was there could be up to 300 million tons in jurisdictional REDD Plus that's issued by 2030. Some of that's already been issued by Guyana. But I think once we start to think about how much of that actually, once we start to deduct the credits that are going to the World Bank and their programs, the credits that are going to participants in the LEAF coalition, that 300 million tons is going to come down pretty quickly.
That's great. And next week on our next episode, we'll talk more about what are the demands for REDD, and that I think was a nice segue into that. Anna, I wanted to give you a minute if you had any final comments about this discussion around supply of REDD.
No, I think it's been really useful to better understand. I think, again, there is a lack of understanding of what these types of jurisdictional REDD credits, what they are, how they can be used, and who will buy them. And I think this is really where we're going to continue talking during the next episode, like you said, Erika. And then I'm looking forward to also understand about Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. Again, who is going to buy? Why are they buying them? For what kind of use, nationally determined contributions that I mentioned earlier, or if we're going to see them exactly what Bryan was talking about, the LEAF coalition, if it's Amazon buying them, why are we buying them? And also, why would you choose these sovereign credits, if you'd like, versus just buying from the voluntary carbon market? So yeah, I'm excited about our next episode already.
That's a great teaser. Can't wait to answer those questions next time and hear Bryan's thoughts. So thank you both for joining us, and tune in next time for answers to those questions.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Whether you're a seasoned ESG practitioner or embarking on your sustainability journey, ESG Decoded is your trusted source for inspiration and actionable insights for responsible business practices. Subscribe on your favorite streaming platforms to be notified of new episodes drop bi-weekly on Tuesday mornings, and connect with us at ESG Decoded on social media or by visiting www.climeco.com.